So, good afternoon. Thanks for attending the session where we're going to talk about enabling compliance with GDPR on AWS. My name is Stephen McDermott. I'm the Head of Security Assurance in the UK. And what that really means is I work with regulators, governing bodies, authorities, help them understand what AWS do, but then also how they can move regulated workloads to AWS. Now, GDPR is not new, believe it or not, even though it comes into force 2 weeks tomorrow. It's not new. It's been around for 2 years now. So we've all had plenty of time to make sure we're comfortable with it. But yet there's still a lot of concern. There's still a lot of confusion around what GDPR really means and how's that going to affect my business and what does that mean to my operations. So hopefully today, with some of the slides we're going to go through, and unfortunately as all slides, it's not like Rick's where there was cool demos and interactive stuff, you know, and you could all play along. I can't do any of that, unfortunately. But what we're going to do is go through some of the tools available to you, how you can use them to meet some of the requirements of GDPR, and really understand how you can manage your data and using those tools. Now, as I said, GDPR has been around for 2 years. It's going to be live 2 weeks tomorrow. And I wonder what's going to happen. I expect nothing will happen. I expect that, 2 weeks tomorrow, we're all going to be sitting there going, OK, it's GDPR, now what? I did consider, coming onto the stage like a Steve Ballmer moment, doing the whole GDPR, yeah, woo! But nobody's that excited about it. Well, we are. We think GDPR is a good thing. Just a quick show of hands, does anybody else think GDPR is a good thing? Are they excited by it? OK, some people are really excited by it. That's a bit strange, especially that guy with 2 hands. But for us, it's a really good thing. And we're going to talk about why that's a good thing. It's a good thing for organizations, but really it's a good thing for data subjects, and that's what we're going to really focus on. So we're going to cover off 7 key areas. I'm going to go around this side because I can see it better. Just really going through what I just explained there. We're going to quickly look what GDPR is. We're going to then talk about the scope of GDPR. Who does it apply to? Is it EU citizens? Is it EU citizens abroad? What comes with GDPR? So what are the requirements of GDPR? What do you have to do? We're then going to match GDPR into the AWS shared responsibility model, which I'm hopeful you will all have seen and be experts on by now. You look after the stuff above the hypervisor, we look after the stuff below. And then we're going to talk about the tools, as I mentioned, the tools and services, and how you can actually use them as technical and organizational measures, which is a fundamental component of GDPR. We're then going to have a quick look at the CISP Code of Conduct, which is a way that AWS demonstrates how we align our services to the requirements of GDPR. And then we're quickly going to cover off some of the additional resources that are available to you, whether it be partners, whether it be ProServe, or whether it just be information from the GDPR Center, which we have. So I'm just going to start. Before we go into the 7 key areas, I just wanted to put up this quote, which is from Steve Schmidt. So he's our Chief Information Security Officer. Every time I read this, I can only think of it in his voice. He's got a very typical projection voice of authority. But I'll read it out in my best Scottish voice that I can. AWS welcomes the arrival of the GDPR. The new robust requirements raise the bar for data protection, security, and compliance, and will push the industry to follow the most stringent controls, helping to make everyone more secure. That's pretty cool. I like the sound of that. Now, the reality is, in AWS, we operate at such a high security bar. It's, I'm sure you've heard this as well. Security is job zero. Everybody is responsible for security. And this really, is what Steve's saying. We welcome anything that helps customers. We welcome anything that adds to that security. Another key quote that I wanted to put up was from Chad Wolf. So Chad Wolf is the Vice President for Security Assurance. And this was released back in March 2016. One thing to point out, sorry, both of these are obviously not the full blog, and I do encourage you to go and look at the blogs. They are actually really interesting. There's a lot more behind these than what I'm just going to cover. But Chad's point was really saying, today I'm very pleased to announce that AWS services comply with the General Data Protection Regulation. This means that in addition to benefiting from all of the measures that AWS already takes to maintain services security, customers can deploy AWS services as a key part of their GDPR compliance plans. Now, what that really means is AWS has completed an 18-month review of all of our AWS services against the requirements of GDPR. We've confirmed that AWS has in place effective technical and organizational measures for data processors to secure personal data in accordance with GDPR. So it's a huge amount of effort went into that piece of work to do that review. So just very briefly, what is the GDPR? So one thing to note, and this is a bit of language, it's the General Data Protection Regulation. It is not a directive. The difference between a regulation and directive, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the directives were down to the member states of the EU to implement. And what happened? We had 28 different implementations of the Data Protection Directive. So the Data Protection Regulation doesn't allow for that. All member states must apply the regulation in accordance with the way that the EU wishes. It introduces robust requirements that will raise and harmonize standards. Again, I've just mentioned there was 28 different implementations of GDPR, with the Data Protection Directive. And really, the GDPR harmonizes all of those. There is now one prescriptive implementation for the EU member states. As I mentioned, 2 weeks tomorrow, it will be enforceable, and it replaces the Data Protection Directive, which was brought into law, I think it was in 1995. So, 1995, 20 plus years since the Data Protection Directive, the world has changed a lot since then. I myself was 13. I wore my hair in the middle parting, and I had dungarees. But also what's happened since 1995 is there's been a huge explosive growth of the internet. And what's happened is that criminals and other threat factors have followed the masses online. They began to realize that the internet was an opportunity. So technology has evolved to make it easy to collect, store, and analyze huge data sets. And that really helped unlock even more value from the data that we're all gathering. So the value of data has really been realized since 1995. And then lastly, as I mentioned, scope. So this does apply to organizations processing details of EU citizens, whether they be in the EU or outside the EU. So there's some key concepts that are worth really understanding, and we're just going to quickly cover them off. So AWS defines content as anything that a customer or any end user stores or processes using AWS services, including software, data, text, audio, or video. Now that could be in S3, it could be in DynamoDB as a database table. So really, it could be anything that you or your customers upload to AWS. And the one thing we'll quickly cover the next definition. The next definition really to think about is personal data. So personal data is defined as information from which a living individual may be identified or identifiable under EU data protection law. Customers' content might include personal data. So there's 2 key words there, might and customers, okay? Now what's important about that is personal data could actually be a picture of a dog. Could be your dog, which is fine, that's content, it's not personal data. But as soon as you call it Stephen's dog, by the very definition of personal data, that image is now personal data. So really, when you're an organization and you're trying to understand really what the impact of GDPR is and what you're going to do about it, you really need to have that deep understanding as to what data you have, where, how you store it, how you process it, and what do you do with it in the end. And that's a huge undertaking if you're doing that in a manual, on-premise legacy infrastructure, which may be spread across multiple data centers. You may know what it is, you may not. So, I can understand why GDPR is such a huge undertaking. So we're just going to quickly cover off some of the key things that GDPR introduces. So one of the first ones really is the right to data portability. And what this really means is that individuals have the right to request from a controller that they provide all of their content in a reusable manner. So that means that you or AWS as a controller must provide all that personal information if we have it. Now, we're going to talk off a bit more about roles and responsibilities. For the majority of this, the customer, the AWS customer, is the controller, AWS is the processor, but we'll cover some of that off later on. Now, to store a large amount of data about somebody is, is clearly a big thing, but then to make it portable, how do you give it to somebody? How do you transfer it? In what format? How can they reuse it? One thing to also make note of is that you must provide all data in relation to use of any services that you provide. So it's not just a case of the data about them, it's the data, the metadata about their use of the service. You must give them that as well. And again, that must be completely portable in a reusable fashion. Next key concept is the right to be forgotten. So when an individual asks you to delete every single bit of data you have about them, you have to do that. You must comply. Again, going back to that audit piece, you must understand where your data exists. You must understand how you store it. What do you do with it? How do you treat it? How do you share it? How do you ensure you're getting rid of it? And also, you as the controller are responsible for getting rid of it if you've published it on the internet. So if you have any links to it, or you have any connections to it, you must get rid of those links. The controller is responsible for doing that. Privacy by design. So no longer is security a bolt-on at the end, which was always the legacy way. Yeah, we've got to build something, we're going to try and do it quick, and yeah, we'll get to security at the end, and then we'll really tighten everything up. The reality was that rarely happened. And so privacy by design really is about building in security from the initial concepts, through the initial design phases, creating policies, guidelines, work instructions that individuals can use and follow to ensure that they understand exactly what privacy by design means. And through the life cycle development, whether you're using agile or waterfall methodologies, they must be taken into account to apply the concepts of privacy by design. Similarly, when you want to then hand whatever it is you're building over into run or through its lifetime management, privacy must be built in through the lifetime management. And this is the one that probably catches a lot of people's eye. Well, listen, the fines, but the fines are the fines, and we'll touch on that later. But the data breach notification. You must notify the supervisory authority within 72 hours of you becoming aware. Now, again, you may be a controller of multiple data sets. You may have multiple supervisor authorities. So again, you really need to understand your obligations. So we've covered off some of the initial concepts. Now, you as an AWS customer, how does this really affect you? So as I mentioned, in most cases, well, let's start again. AWS, when you sign up to an AWS account and you provide your personal information, you want to use AWS services, in that instance, AWS is the controller. You have given us your personal information. We will process it. We decide what we do with it. We're the controller. In an instance where you as AWS customer then starts using our services to then start capturing your customers' data, you decide how it's then processed and the means of capturing it, then in that instance, you're the controller and AWS is the processor. And just to even confuse matters even more, there's then the scenario where an AWS customer sells a service built on AWS services to one of their customers. So you've built something, you've built an infrastructure, a service, a tool. You've then sold that to your customer, and then your customer starts offering services using those tools. So all of a sudden, AWS's customer determines the purpose and means of processing the personal data, and therefore their controller. The AWS customer is then the processor, and AWS is also the processor. But in both scenarios that we've just covered, the controller is ultimately responsible for implementing the appropriate technical and organizational measures. The controller is also responsible for ensuring that the processor has the right technical and organizational measures in place. So you must do your due diligence on us, and you must do it on yourself as well. So it's really important that you understand the responsibilities in play, and we'll come back to discussing some of the technical and organizational measures, or TOMs as they're called, shortly. So you've seen this before. This is the AWS Coverage Map, I think we call it. It's not actually correct, so don't count them, but we actually have 18 regions and 54 availability zones. Now, as with anything in this, we provide that infrastructure, but you as the customer is ultimately responsible for where you store your data. You choose which region you put it in, you choose the availability zone you put it in, and you remain in control of it at all times. AWS will never move it, full stop. Within the EU, we have 3 regions. So we have Ireland, we have Frankfurt, and we have London. Sorry, Dublin, Frankfurt, and London. So even within the European area, you can choose to move data freely between regions, between AZs within regions. So you now know that you can transfer data internally within Europe. You've got 3 European regions, but you can also transfer it outside the European Union. And what we have in place for that is our DP addendums with the contractual model clauses that allow you to have legal cover to say that you understand the obligations and the mechanisms in place for transferring that data. Similarly, for where you have to transfer EU to the US or to Switzerland, there is a privacy shield framework, which again is available to you as a customer. So now more on the TOMs, the technical and organizational measures. What do those really mean? Well, GDPR says that you must, controllers and processors are required to implement appropriate TOMs. Now, for example, that could mean pseudonymization. So pseudonymization is the process of decoupling the personal data from the data set, which then allows you to use that data set in multiple ways that you maybe couldn't with the personal data included. Pseudonymized data can also be reconstructed with the addition of some additional information, which allows you to then re-identify individuals that are in the data subjects that are in that data set. So it's a great safeguard. As is encryption, obviously. If you encrypt the data, it's a safeguard you can put in place if the data gets lost or if it gets stolen, it's rendered unusable without the keys. It's worth noting, though, that this is not a hard requirement of GDPR. This is obviously a really good thing to do, and it's encouraged, but there are instances where these may not apply. Where these may not be suitable. So this means that controllers must put in place mechanisms, number 2, ensure ongoing confidentiality, integrity, availability, and resilience of processing systems. What this really means is that controllers must put in place mechanisms to demonstrate that no unauthorized access occurs. So making sure that you have tight data access control. You have to make sure that the data integrity is maintained and that systems are monitored and available. The next one, the ability to restore availability and access to personal data in a timely manner in the event of a physical or technical incident. What that's really talking about is data portability. So we talked about that earlier on, where a data subject can come to you and ask, I want a copy of all my data now, regardless of what's going on in your organization. You must have the mechanisms in place to have access to that data. You must have the mechanisms in place to provide that data in a format that's reusable. And then the last one, process for regular testing. Well, really what we're talking about there is third-party audit reports as part of a certification process. And again, we'll touch on some of those that AWS has shortly. So now that we've covered off some of the fundamentals of GDPR, we've talked about TOMs, technical and organizational measures, we've talked about some of the new data subject rights. Let's have a quick look at how AWS can help you with some of those. What are the tools that we provide and the services that we provide? We're then going to have a quick look at the compliance frameworks, which obviously sit underneath all of this. We'll then talk about the partner network and very briefly on partner data protection terms. So hopefully you've all seen this type of diagram before. This is the shared responsibility model. Customers are responsible for the security compliance in the cloud. AWS is responsible for the security of the cloud. You'll hear that pretty much at every AWS event you attend. As I mentioned, the fundamental services that AWS are responsible for sit at the bottom. So we've got compute, storage, database, networking, availability zones, regions, edge locations. They're all part of the AWS Strong Compliance Framework. So we undertake all of that effort, we do all that due diligence, we go through all that assurance to allow customers to securely build on top of that platform. And then if you look at the kind of boxes within the customer responsibility, where you've got client-side encryption, server-side encryption, network traffic protection, those are all TOMs. They are technical and organizational measures that you, as the controller, can put in place. And GDPR is also part of a shared responsibility. So I'm not going to go into every single one of these, because it would be here for a long time. But it's worth understanding how the shared responsibility model applies to GDPR. As you'll notice, some of these, again, have shared responsibility. You as the controller has responsibility. We as the processor have responsibility. But there are also quite a few which are entirely your responsibility as the controller. So for example, managing data subject consent. As we mentioned earlier on, AWS has no control over the data. AWS is completely content agnostic. So we can't tell if the data you're putting up is personal data or whether it's mum's recipe for sticky toffee pudding. So you're responsible for ensuring that you have data consent, data subject consent. You're also responsible for looking at the data portability, as we've covered, and also you're responsible for the security of that data. So again, the TOMs and technical organizational measures that we've just talked about. And thinking back to the scenarios which I discussed earlier, there's going to be times when you as an AWS customer may be both controller and processor. So it's really important that you understand the responsibilities between you and your customers as well. So now that we've talked about TOMs, we've talked very quickly on the responsibilities, and we're going to have a quick look at some of the tools and services that AWS can help you with the GDPR compliance and how you can use them. So on the left-hand side, you can see we have services under the category of data protection by design and by default. Again, a fundamental concept within GDPR. We have Snowball, again, talking about data portability, allows you to take data sets away, secure at scale, and also ingest data secure at scale. We have Amazon Virtual Private Cloud, so again, securing your virtual network, your virtual private cloud, allowing you to isolate data sets, allowing you to isolate services and tools. We then have IAM, Active Directory Integration, and SAML down the bottom, so making sure that you have the appropriate data access controls in place to ensure data confidentiality. On the right-hand side, we quickly talked about some encryption, and we'll cover some of it later on, but you have KMS, Cloud HSM, and server-side encryption, and then some of the stuff along the bottom again, which we'll go into some more detail on later. So, as I mentioned, we've got data access control. The controller should implement appropriate technical and organizational measures for ensuring that by default, only personal data which are necessary for each specific purpose of the processing are processed. It's a mouthful. But what it's basically saying is you must put controls in place that limit access to data, and you must know where that data has been processed. Now, some of the tools that we have in place will allow you to do that. So we've got MFA. Obviously, the entire AWS platform is built on APIs, which are authenticated. And we issue STS as well, so a simple security token service. And this is just a quick example to cover it. So we have a parent account which wants to do something or access a data set. It goes into IAM to get privileged account details, which then grant it the temporary credentials through a ticket. The parent account then uses those credentials to then access the resources that only the resources it needs when it needs it. So again, ensuring that you have appropriate data access control in place, making sure you're restricting that access. Each controller, and where applicable, the controller's representative shall maintain a record of processing activities under its responsibility. So we have CloudTrail, Inspector, Macy, Config. We'll cover CloudTrail a bit in a minute, but Amazon Inspector, which analyzes resource behavior and identifies potential security issues of infrastructure. We've got Macy, which is a security service that uses machine learning to continuously and automatically discover, classify, and protect sensitive data in AWS. It can classify sensitive data such as PII. It can classify sensitive data such as intellectual property. It can also detect sensitive AWS account information. So again, thinking back to those requirements of GDPR, where you have to demonstrate that you're implementing TOMs to effectively manage your data and access, these are some of the tools that can enable you to do that. Now, CloudTrail. So hopefully, most of you will know what CloudTrail is, but CloudTrail, as I mentioned, AWS is built entirely on APIs. So anything that you want to do on AWS generates an API. Every API can then be stored in CloudTrail, which then allows you to do a whole bunch of, allows you to put in place a whole bunch of technical and organizational measures. So whether you're using the management console, whether you're using the CLI or an application to generate or interact with AWS resources, it all goes through an API, which can then be archived into an S3 bucket for archive and audits, or it can be used to troubleshoot immediately, or even can go into CloudWatch to generate events and workflows. Guard duty, so if you remember ourselves back to when we had the 4 TOMs up in place, number 2 was, I think it was ensure ongoing confidentiality, integrity, and availability and resilience of processing systems and services. Well, Amazon Guard Duty can help you with that. So Amazon Guard Duty is a managed threat detection service that continuously monitors for malicious or unauthorized behavior. It's capable of identifying unusual API calls. So again, where you have an infrastructure that is not behaving in the way you expect, Guard Duty can detect that. It can identify potentially unauthorized deployments, so indicating possible account compromise. Again, thinking these as technical and organizational measures that you can place to demonstrate your compliance with GDPR. It also integrates with CloudWatch for alerting and remediation. So when we think back to the data breach notification requirement, it's important to have tools that provide you with the ability to really investigate any personal data breach, to ensure you fully understand the impact, to ensure that when you report it to the supervisory authority, you can give them a clear picture of how bad that breach is. Encryption, we won't go over, but obviously encryption allows you to put safeguards in place to protect the data. Again, we offer a whole bunch of services around that. We have S3 default of AES 256, or you can use AWS KMS. Yeah, encryption. There's plenty of options for you to put in place. Again, as a technical and organizational measure, we're not prescriptive about it. We leave that open to you as the data controller. And then I briefly touched on the strong compliance framework. So this is really what AWS is responsible for as part of the shared responsibility model. So we go through all of our assurance and certification processes to ensure that you can take confidence in that we do what we say we do from an independent third party. But that really allows you to build on top of that secure framework. It allows you to then understand your scope and what you're responsible for. Like that. So again, if you think back to the TOMs, number 4 was there's a requirement to regularly test and assess the effectiveness and the value at the TOMs. So how do you do that? Well, typically you do it through independent third-party audits. And obviously that's what we've done with 9001, which looks at quality management, 27001, which looks at physical network process policy elements, 27017, which looks at security controls for cloud services, and then 27018, which really looks at PI and clouds acting as PI processors. So these are all things that we have done to enable your compliance and assurance regimes. So as I mentioned, it's a bit fancy with a spinning thing. GDPR introduces a new concept with codes of conduct. And the purpose of codes of conduct is really for organizations to take confidence in what we say we do. So in order for us to be aligned with a code of conduct, we have to demonstrate how we comply with the requirements of GDPR. We have to provide that evidence to the CISP, who we've chosen in this instance. And this really allows customers to have confidence that their cloud provider is compliant with the GDPR requirements as certified by an independent third party. And it's important because the role that CISP is going to play going forward is going to continue on that role. It's going to continue to be that independent third party for GDPR for us. We've covered off some of the tools and services, obviously, that we offer, but we have an extensive partner network which allow you to implement some other technical and organizational measures. We are not the only measures you can put in place. So through threat analytics, through to identity and access management, we have a whole host of partners available in the marketplace, which you can enable typically with a couple of simple clicks. And in most cases, you can bring your own license. So again, where you maybe have expertise or you have these on-premise infrastructures or systems that use some of these services, then you can move them to AWS. That's the whole purpose of the marketplace. It allows you to do that. As I mentioned, we also have some consulting partners. So really you can, if you're really struggling with understanding, well, how can I make sure I'm GDPR compliant? What else do I need to do? Then there are some of the partners that we have available. This is not an extensive list. We will be adding to this, and it will be getting developed over time. But we also have technology partners, as I mentioned, that were on some of the previous slides. And then we also have our own in-house AWS professional services. So the AWS professional services offering is really about coming on site, working with you and your customers, understanding what you're concerned about, understanding what risks you want to address, and really helping you build confidence with your GDPR compliance efforts. We go through some of these key activities which really look at how you can, we talked earlier on about the data audit process, so really understanding where your data is, how do you process it, what do you do with it, we can help you with that. We also then can look at the access controls, can you as the controller confirm who has access to all the personal identifiable information within your organization? We then can help you with breach notification as well. So, again, understanding your data, understanding who your supervisory authorities are. What do you need to do if something happens? Who do you tell? Who do you report it to? And then lastly, if you need any additional information from an AWS perspective, we have our GDPR Center, which provides there's a lot of new information up there regularly. It has the GDPR white paper, which again talks in a lot more detail about the things we've covered off today. And I suggest you go back to that regularly because it will be updated, it will change, and there'll be more and more information getting deployed on there as we move towards, well, beyond next week, next 2 weeks. And that's quickly it from me. But I'll be around after the event if anybody wants to come and have a chat. And thank you all for your time, and hopefully your GDPR efforts are going well and you're sitting back relaxed 2 weeks on Friday. Thank you.